April 1945. They had lived for months in the cellar, like rats. When the British were bombing by day and the Americans by night, there was nothing else for it. The cellar beneath the apartment block in the Savannahplatz was dank and disgusting, a small paraffin lamp for light and one bucket for a lavatory, yet the cellar was better than one of the bunkers in town. She had been caught with Frida near the zoo in a daylight raid, and had taken shelter in the zoo station flak tower, thousands of people crammed in, the air supply gauged by a candle, as if they were canaries. If the candle goes out, someone told her, everyone has to leave, out into the open even if a raid is in progress. Near to where they were crushed against a wall, a man and a woman were embracing, a polite term for what they were doing, and as they were leaving they had to step over an old man who had died during the raid. The worst thing, even worse than this, was that as well as being a shelter, the enormous concrete citadel was a gigantic anti-aircraft battery, several huge guns pounding away on the roof the whole time, so that the shelter shook with every recoil. It was the closest to hell that Ursula ever hoped to come. An enormous explosion had shaken the structure, a bomb dropped close to the zoo. She felt the pressure wave sucking and pushing her body, and was terrified that Frida's lungs might burst. It passed. Several people vomited, although unfortunately there was nowhere to vomit except on one's feet, or perhaps worse, on other people's feet. Ursula vowed never to go into a flak tower again. She would rather, she thought, die out in the street, quickly, with Frida. That's what she thought about a lot of the time now. A swift, clean death, Frida wrapped in her arms. Perhaps it was Teddy up there, dropping bombs on them. She hoped it was, it would mean he was alive. There had been a knock on the door one day, when they still had a door, before the British started their relentless bombing in November 43. When Ursula opened the door she found a thin youth standing there, 15 or 16 years old maybe. He had a desperate air and Ursula wondered if he was looking for somewhere to hide, but he pushed an envelope into her hand, and ran off before she could even say a word to him. The envelope was creased and filthy. Her name and address were written on it and she burst into tears at the sight of Pamela's handwriting. Thin papery blue sheets, dated several weeks ago, detailing all the comings and goings of her family, Jimmy in the army, Sylvie fighting the good fight on the home front, a new weapon, chickens. Pamela was well and living at Fox Corner, she said, for boys now. Teddy in the RAF, a squadron leader with a DFC. A lovely long letter and at the end a page that was almost like a postscript, I have saved the sad news to last. Hugh was dead. In the autumn of 1940, peacefully, a heart attack. Ursula wished she hadn't received the letter, wished she could think of Hugh still alive, of Teddy and Jimmy in non-combatant roles, living out the war in a coal mine or civil defense. I think of you constantly, Pamela said. No recriminations, no I told you so, no why didn't you come home when you could have done. She had tried, too late of course. The day after Germany declared war on Poland she had gone through town, dutifully doing the things that she thought you were supposed to do when war was imminent. She stocked up on batteries and torches and candles, she bought canned goods and blackout material, she shopped for clothes for Frida in Wertheim's department store, 1 and 2 sizes bigger in case the war went on for a long time. She bought nothing for herself, passing by all those warm coats and boots, stockings and decent frocks, something she bitterly regretted now. She heard Chamberlain on the BBC, those fateful words, we are now at war with Germany, and for several hours felt strangely numb. She tried to phone Pamela but the lines were all engaged. Then towards evening, Jurgen had been at the ministry all day, she suddenly came back to life, snow-white awake. She must leave, she must go back to England, passport or no. She packed a hasty suitcase and harried Frida onto a tram to the station. If she could just get on a train somehow everything would be all right. No trains, an official at the station told her. The borders were closed. We're at war, didn't you know, he said. She ran to the British embassy in Wilhelmstrasse, dragging poor Frida by the hand. They were German citizens, but she would throw herself on the mercy of the embassy staff, Surely they would be able to do something, she was still an Englishwoman after all. It was growing dark by then and the gates were padlocked and there were no lights on in the building. They've gone, a passerby told her. You've missed them. Gone? Back to Britain. She had to clap a hand over her mouth to stop the wail that rose up from deep inside her. How could she have been so stupid? Why hadn't she seen what was coming? A fool too late bewares when all the peril is past. Something else that Elizabeth I had said. She wept on and off for 2 days after receiving Pamela's letter. Jurgen was sympathetic, came home with some real coffee for her, and she didn't ask where he had got it. A good cup of coffee, miraculous as that was hardly going to assuage her grief for her father, for Frida, for herself. For everybody. Jurgen died in an American raid in '44. Ursula was ashamed at how relieved she felt when she was given the news, especially as Frida was so upset. She loved her father and he loved her, which was a nugget of grace to be salvaged from the whole sorry business of their marriage. Frida was ill now. She had the same gaunt features and sickly pallor of most people you saw on the streets these days, but her lungs were full of phlegm, and she had terrible bouts of coughing that seemed as though they would never end. When Ursula listened to her chest it was like listening to a galleon at sea, heaving and creaking through the waves. If only she could sit her down by a big warm fire, give her hot cocoa to drink, a beef stew, dumplings, carrots. Were they still eating well on the Berg, she wondered? Was anyone still on the Berg? Above their heads, the apartment block was still standing although most of the front wall had been taken away by a bomb. They still went up there to forage for anything useful. It had been saved from looting by the almost insurmountable difficulty of getting up the staircase, which was filled with rubble. She and Frida tied pieces of cushion to their knees with rags, and wore thick leather gloves that had belonged to Jurgen, and in this way clambered over the stones and bricks like inept monkeys. The one thing there was nothing of in the apartment was the only thing they were interested in: food. Yesterday they had queued for 3 hours for a loaf of bread. When they ate it, it seemed to contain no actual flour, although it was hard to say what it did contain: cement dust and plaster. That was what it tasted of anyway. Ursula remembered Rogerson's the bakers in the village at home, how the smell of the baking bread would waft through the street, and how the bakery's window was full of lovely soft white loaves burnished with a sticky bronze glaze. Or the kitchen at Fox Corner on Mrs. Glover's baking days, the big brown, health loaves that Sylvie insisted on, but also the sponges and tarts and buns. She imagined eating a slice of the warm brown bread, thickly buttered, with the jam made from the raspberries and red currants at Fox Corner. She tormented herself with memories of food the whole time. There was to be no more milk, someone told her in the bread queue. This morning, Fräulein Farber and her sister Frau Meyer, who had lived together in the attic, but who now rarely left the cellar, gave her 2 potatoes and a piece of cooked sausage for Frida, aus Anstand, they said, out of decency. Herr Richter, also a cellar resident, told Ursula that the sisters had decided to stop eating. An easy thing to do when there was no food, Ursula thought. They have had enough, he said. They cannot face what will happen when the Russians get here. They had heard a rumor that in the East people were reduced to eating grass. Lucky them, Ursula thought, there was no grass in Berlin, just the black skeletal remains of a proud and beautiful city. Was London like this too? It seemed unlikely, yet possible. Speer had his noble ruins, 1,000 years early. The inedible bread yesterday, 2 half-raw potatoes the day before, that was all Ursula had in her own stomach. Everything else, for the little it was worth, she'd given to Frida. But what good would it do Frida if Ursula were dead? She couldn't leave her alone in this terrible world. After the British raid on the zoo they had gone to see if there were any animals they could eat, but plenty of people had got there before them. Could that happen at home? Londoners scavenging in Regent's Park Zoo. Why not? They still saw the occasional bird that was clearly not native to Berlin, surviving against the odds, and on one occasion, a cowed, mangy creature that they had taken for a dog before they realized it was a wolf. Frida was all for trying to take it back to the cellar with them and making a pet of it. Ursula couldn't even imagine what their elderly neighbor Frau Jaeger's reaction would have been to that. Their own apartment was like a doll's house, open to the world, all the intimate details of their domestic life on view, beds and sofas, the pictures on the walls, even an ornament or two that had miraculously survived the blast. They had raided anything truly useful, but there were still some clothes and a few books, and only yesterday she had found a cache of candles beneath a pile of broken crockery. Ursula was hoping to trade them in for medicine for Frida. There was still a lavatory in the bathroom, and occasionally, who knew how, there was water. One of them would stand and hold up an old sheet to protect the other's modesty. Did their modesty matter that much anymore? Ursula had made the decision to move back in. It was cold in the apartment, but the air wasn't fetid, and she judged that on balance that would be better for Frida. They still had blankets and quilts they could wrap themselves in, and they shared a mattress on the floor, behind a barricade formed by the dining table and chairs. Ursula's thoughts strayed constantly to the meals they had eaten at that table, her dreams full of meat, pork and beef, slabs of it grilled and roasted and fried. The apartment was 2 floors up, and this, combined with the partially blocked staircase, might be enough to put the Russians off. On the other hand, they would be the dolls on display in the doll's house, a woman and a girl ripe for the plucking. Frida would soon be 11, but if even 1/10 of the rumors coming from the east were true, then her age wouldn't save her from the Russians. Frau Jaeger never stopped talking nervously about how the Soviets were raping and murdering their way towards Berlin. There was no wireless anymore, just rumor and the occasional flimsy piece of news sheet. The name Nemmersdorf was rarely off Frau Jaeger's lips, a massacre. "Oh, do shut up," Ursula said to her the other day. In English, which she didn't understand, of course, although she must have heard the unfriendly tone. Frau Jaeger had been visibly startled to be addressed in the language of the enemy, and Ursula felt sorry. She was just a frightened old lady, she reminded herself. The East moved nearer every day. Interest in the Western Front had long since died, only the East was of concern. The distant thunder of guns now replaced by a constant roar. There was no one to save them. 80,000 German troops to defend them against 1.5 million Soviets, and most of those German troops seemed to be children or old men. Perhaps poor old Frau Jaeger would be called upon to beat off the enemy with a broom handle. It could only be a matter of days, hours even, before they saw their first Russian. There was a rumor that Hitler was dead. Not before time, Herr Richter said. Ursula remembered the sight of him asleep on his sun lounger on the terrace on the Berg. He had strutted and fretted his hour upon the stage. To what avail? A kind of Armageddon. The death of Europe. It was life itself, wasn't it, she corrected herself, that Shakespeare had fretting and strutting. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. They were all walking shadows in Berlin. Life had mattered so much once, and now it was the cheapest thing on offer. She spared an idle thought for Eva. She was always blasé about the idea of suicide. Had she accompanied her leader into hell? Frida was so poorly now, chills and fever, and complaining almost constantly of a headache. If she hadn't been sick, they might have joined the exodus of people heading west, away from the Russians, but there was no way she would survive such a journey. "I've had enough, Mummy," she whispered, a terrible echo of the sisters from the attic. Ursula left her alone while she hurried to the chemist, scrabbling over the debris that littered the streets, occasionally a corpse. She felt nothing for the dead anymore. She cowered in doorways when the gunfire seemed too close, and then scurried to the next street corner. The chemist was open, but he had no medicine. He didn't even want her precious candles or her money. She came back defeated. The whole time she had been away from Frida, she had been anxious that something would happen to her in her absence, and she promised herself that she wouldn't leave her side again. She had seen a Russian tank 2 streets away. She had been terrified by the sight. How much more terrified would Frida be? The noise of artillery fire was constant. She was gripped by the idea that the world was ending. If it was, then Frida must die in her arms, not alone. But whose arms would she die in? She longed for the safety of her father, and the thought of Hugh made the tears start. By the time she had climbed the rubble staircase, she was exhausted, weary to the bone. She found Frida slipping in and out of delirium, and lay down beside her on the mattress on the floor. Stroking her damp hair, she talked in a low voice to her about another world. She told her about the bluebells in spring in the wood near Fox Corner, about the flowers that grew in the meadow beyond the copse, flax and larkspur, buttercups, corn poppies, red campion, and oxeye daisies. She told her about the smell of new-mown grass from an English summer lawn, the scent of Sylvie's roses, the sour-sweet taste of the apples in the orchard. She talked of the oak trees in the lane, and the yews in the graveyard, and the beech in the garden at Fox Corner. She talked about the foxes, the rabbits, the pheasants, the hares, the cows, and the big plough horses. About the sun beaming his friendly rays on fields of corn and fields of green. The bright song of the blackbird, the lyrical lark, the soft coo of the wood pigeons. The hoot of the owl in the dark. "Take this," she said, putting the pill in Frida's mouth. "I got it from the chemist, it will help you sleep." She told Frida how she would walk on knives to protect her, burn in the flames of hell to save her, drown in the deepest of waters, if it would buoy her up, and how she would do this one last thing for her, the most difficult thing of all. She put her arms around her daughter and kissed her and murmured in her ear, telling her about Teddy when he was little, his surprise birthday party, about how clever Pamela was and how annoying Maurice was and how funny Jimmy had been when he was small. How the clock ticked in the hall, and the wind rattled in the chimney pots, and how on Christmas Eve they lit an enormous log fire, and hung their stockings from the mantelpiece, and next day ate roast goose, and plum pudding, and how that was what they would all do next Christmas, all of them together. "Everything is going to be all right now," Ursula told her. When she was sure that Frida was asleep, she took the little glass capsule that the chemist had given her, and placed it gently in Frida's mouth, and pressed her delicate jaws together. The capsule broke with a tiny crunching noise. A line from one of Donne's holy sonnets came into mind, as she bit down on her own little glass vial. "I run to death, and death meets me as fast, and all my pleasures are like yesterday." She held tightly onto Frida, and soon they were both wrapped in the velvet wings of the black bat, and this life was already unreal and gone. She had never chosen death over life before, and as she was leaving she knew something had cracked and broken, and the order of things had changed. Then the dark obliterated all thoughts. A long hard war. September 1940. "See where Christ's blood streams across the firmament," a voice nearby said. In the firmament, Ursula thought, not across. The red glow of a false dawn indicated a massive fire in the east. The barge in Hyde Park cracked and flared, and the anti-aircraft guns closer to home were doing a good job of keeping up their own cacophony, shells whistling into the air like fireworks and cracking as they exploded high overhead. And beneath it all was the horrible throbbing drone of the bombers' unsynchronized engines, a sound that always made her stomach feel pitchy. A parachute mine floated down gracefully, and a basket of incendiaries rattled their contents onto what was left of the road and burst into flowers of fire. A warden, Ursula couldn't make out his face, ran across to the incendiaries with a stirrup pump. If there had been no noise it might have seemed a beautiful nightscape, but there was noise, brutish dissonance that sounded as if someone had thrown open the gates of hell, and let out the howling of the damned. "Why, this is hell, nor am I out of it," the voice spoke again as if reading her thoughts. It was so dark that she could barely make out the owner of the voice, although she knew without a doubt that it belonged to Mr. Durkin, one of the wardens from her post. He was a retired English teacher, much inclined to quoting and misquoting. The voice, or Mr. Durkin, said something else. It may still have been Faustus, but the words disappeared into the enormous whump of a bomb falling a couple of streets away. The ground shook, and another voice, that of someone working on the mound, yelled, "Watch out." She heard something shifting, and a noise like displaced scree rattling and rolling down a mountain, the harbinger of an avalanche. Rubble, not scree. And a mound of it, not a mountain. The rubble that comprised the mound was all that was left of a house, or rather, several houses all ground and mashed into each other now. The rubble had been homes half an hour ago, now those same homes were just a hellish jumble of bricks, broken joists and floorboards, furniture, pictures, rugs, bedding, books, crockery, lino, glass. People. The crushed fragments of lives, never to be whole again. The rumble slowed to a trickle and finally stopped, the avalanche averted, and the same voice shouted, "All right. Carry on." It was a moonless night, the only light coming from the masked torches of the heavy rescue squad, ghostly will-o'-the-wisps, moving on the mound. The other reason for the immense, treacherous dark was the thick cloud of smoke and dust that hung like a curtain of vile gossamer in the air. The stink, as usual, was awful. It wasn't just the smell of coal gas and high explosive, it was the aberrant odor produced when a building was blown to smithereens. The smell of it wouldn't leave her. She had tied an old silk scarf around her mouth and nose, bandit style, but it did little to stop the dust and the stench getting into her lungs. Death and decay were on her skin, in her hair, in her nostrils, her lungs, beneath her fingernails, all the time. They had become part of her. They had only recently been issued with overalls, navy blue and unflattering. Until now Ursula had been wearing her shelter suit, but almost as a novelty item by Sylvie from Simpsons soon after war was declared. She had added an old leather belt of Hugh's from which she'd strung her accessories, a torch, gas mask, a first aid packet and a message pad. In one pocket she had a penknife and a handkerchief, and in the other a pair of thick leather gloves and a lipstick. "Oh, what a good idea," Miss Wolf said when she saw the penknife. Let's face it, Ursula thought, despite a host of regulations, they were making it up as they went along. Mr. Durkin, for it was indeed he, resolved himself out of the gloom and foggy smoke. He shone his torch onto his notebook, the weak light barely illuminating the paper. "A lot of people live on this street," he said, peering at the list of names and house numbers which no longer bore any relation to the surrounding havoc. "The Wilsons are at number 1, he said, as if beginning at the beginning would somehow help. "There is no number 1 anymore," Ursula said. "There are no numbers at all." The street was unrecognizable, everything familiar annihilated. Even in broad daylight it would have been unrecognizable. It wasn't a street anymore, it was simply the mound. 20 feet high, maybe more, with planks and ladders running up its sides to enable the heavy rescue squad to crawl over it. There was something primitive about the human chain they had formed, passing debris in baskets from hand to hand, from the top of the mound to the bottom. They could have been slaves building the pyramids, or in this case, excavating them. Ursula thought suddenly of the leaf cutter ants that used to be in Regent's Park Zoo, each one dutifully carrying its little burden. Had the ants been evacuated along with the other animals, or had they simply set them free in the park? They were tropical insects, so perhaps they would not be able to survive the rigors of the climate of Regent's Park. She had seen Millie there in an open-air production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, in the summer of '38. "Miss Todd." "Yes, sorry, Mr. Durkin, miles away." It happened a lot these days, she would be in the middle of these awful scenes, and she would find that she had drifted off to pleasant moments in the past. Little slivers of light in the darkness. They made their way warily towards the mound. Mr. Durkin passed the list of the street's residents to her and started giving a hand with the chain of baskets. No one was actually digging on the mound, instead they were clearing the rubble by hand, like careful archaeologists. "A bit delicate up there," one of the rescue squad near the bottom of the chain said to her. A shaft had been cleared, going down the middle of the mound, a volcano then, rather than a mound, Ursula thought. A lot of the men in the heavy rescue squad were from the building trade, bricklayers, laborers and so on, and Ursula wondered if it felt odd to them to be scrambling over these dismantled buildings, as if time had somehow gone backwards. But then they were pragmatic, resourceful men who were not much given to this kind of fantastical thinking. Occasionally a voice would call for quiet, impossible when the raid was still going on overhead, but nonetheless everything would stop while the men at the top of the mound listened intently for signs of life within. It looked hopeless, but if there was one thing that the Blitz had taught them, it was that people lived and died in the most unlikely of circumstances. Ursula searched in the gloom for the dim blue lights that marked out the incident officer's post and instead caught sight of Miss Wolfe, stumbling purposefully over broken bricks towards her. "It's bad," she said matter-of-factly when she reached Ursula. "They need someone slight." "Slight," Ursula repeated. The word, for some reason, was devoid of meaning. She had joined the ARP as a warden after the invasion of Czechoslovakia in March '39, when it suddenly seemed horribly clear to her that Europe was doomed. "What a gloomy Cassandra you are," Sylvie said, but Ursula worked in the air raid precautions department at the Home Office. She could see the future. During the strange twilight of the phony war, the wardens had been something of a joke, but now they were the backbone of London's defences. This from Maurice. Her fellow wardens were a mixed bunch. Miss Wolfe, a retired hospital matron, was the senior warden. Thin and straight as a poker, her iron-grey hair in a neat bun, she came with natural authority. Then there was her deputy, the aforesaid Mr. Durkin, Mr. Sims, who worked for the Ministry of Supply, and Mr. Palmer, who was a bank manager. The latter two men had fought in the last war, and were too old for this one. Mr. Durkin had been medically exempt, he said defensively. Then there was Mr. Armitage, who was an opera singer, and as there were no operas to sing in any more, he kept them entertained with his renditions of La Donna e Mobile and Largo al Factotum. Just the popular arias, he confided to Ursula. Most people don't like anything challenging. "Give me old Al Bowley any day," Mr. Bullock said. The rather aptly named Mr. Bullock, John, was in Miss Wolfe's words a little questionable. He certainly cut a strapping figure, he wrestled competitively and lifted weights in a local gym, as well as being the denizen of several of the less salubrious nightclubs. He was also acquainted with some rather glamorous dancers. One or two had dropped in on him in the shelter, and been shooed away like chickens by Miss Wolfe. "Dancers, my eye," she said. Last but not least there was Herr Zimmermann. "Gabby, please," he said, but no one did, who was an orchestra violinist from Berlin, our refugee, as they referred to him. Sylvie had evacuees, similarly denoted by their circumstances. He had jumped ship in '35 while on tour with his orchestra. Miss Wolfe, who knew him through the refugee committee, had gone to great lengths to make sure that Herr Zimmermann and his violin were not interned, or worse, shipped across the lethal waters of the Atlantic. They all followed Miss Wolfe's lead and never addressed him as Mr., always as Herr. Ursula knew that Miss Wolfe called him thus to make him feel at home, but it only succeeded in making more of an alien of him. Miss Wolfe had come across Herr Zimmermann in the course of her work for the Central British Fund for German Jewry, rather a mouthful, I'm afraid. Ursula was never sure whether Miss Wolfe was a woman of some influence, or whether she simply refused to take no for an answer. Both, perhaps. "A cultured lot, aren't we?" Mr. Bullock said sarcastically. "Why don't we just put on shows instead of fighting a war?" "Mr. Bullock is a man of strong emotions," Miss Wolfe said to Ursula. "And strong drink too," Ursula thought. Strong everything, in fact. A small hall belonging to the Methodists had been commandeered to be their post by Miss Wolfe, herself a Methodist, and they had furnished it with a couple of camp beds, a small stove with tea-making equipment, and an assortment of chairs, both hard and soft. Compared to some posts, compared to many, it was luxurious. Mr. Bullock turned up one night with a green baize card table, and Miss Wolfe declared herself rather fond of bridge. Mr. Bullock, in the lull between the fall of France and the first raids at the beginning of September, had taught them all poker. Quite the card sharp, Mr. Sims said. Both he and Mr. Palmer lost several shillings to Mr. Bullock. Miss Wolfe, on the other hand, was £2 up by the time the Blitz started. An amused Mr. Bullock expressed surprise that Methodists were allowed to gamble. Her winnings bought a dartboard, so Mr. Bullock had nothing to complain about, she said. One day when they were clearing a jumble of boxes in the corner of the hall, they discovered that a piano had been hiding there all along, and Miss Wolf, who was proving a woman of many talents, was a rather good player. Although her own tastes tended towards Chopin and Liszt, she was more than game to bash out a few tunes, Mr. Bullock's words, for them all to sing along to. They had fortified the post with sandbags, although none of them believed that they would be of any use if they were hit. Apart from Ursula, who thought that taking precautions seemed an eminently sensible idea, they all tended to agree with Mr. Bullock that if it's got your name on it, it's got your name on it, a form of Buddhist detachment that Dr. Kellett would have admired. There had been an obituary in the Times during the summer. Ursula was rather glad that Dr. Kellett had missed another war. It would have reminded him of the futility of Guy losing everything at Arras. They were all part-time volunteers, apart from Miss Wolf, who was paid in full-time, and took her duties very seriously. She subjected them to rigorous drills and made sure they did their training, in anti-gas procedures, in extinguishing incendiaries, how to enter burning buildings, load stretchers, make splints, bandage limbs. She questioned them on the contents of the manuals that she made them read, and she was very keen on them learning how to label bodies, both alive and dead, so that they could be sent off like parcels to the hospital or the mortuary with all the correct information attached. They had done several exercises out in the open where they had acted out a mock raid. Play acting, Mr. Bullock scoffed, failing to get into the spirit of things. Ursula played a casualty twice, once having to feign a broken leg, and on another occasion complete unconsciousness. Another time she had been on the other side, and as a warden had to deal with Mr. Armitage simulating someone in hysterical shock. She supposed it was his experience on stage that enabled him to give such an unervingly authentic performance. It was quite hard to persuade him out of character at the end of the exercise. They had to know the occupants of every building in their sector, whether they had a shelter of their own, or whether they went to a public one, or whether they too were fatalists, and didn't bother at all. They had to know if anyone had gone away or moved, married, had a baby, died. They had to know where the hydrants were, cul-de-sacs, narrow alleyways, cellars, rest centers. Patrol and watch, that was Miss Wolf's motto. They tended to patrol the streets in pairs until midnight, when there was usually a lull, and then if there were no bombs in their sector they would have a polite argument over who should occupy the camp beds. Of course, if there was a raid in their streets, then it was all hands to the pumps in Miss Wolf's words. Sometimes they did the watching from her flat, 2 stories up with an excellent view from a big corner window. Miss Wolf also did extra first aid exercises with them. As well as having been a hospital matron, she had run a field hospital during the last war and explained to them, as you will appreciate, those of you gentlemen who saw active service in that dreadful conflict, that casualties in war were very different from the routine accidents that one saw in peacetime. Much nastier, she said. We must be prepared for some distressing sights. Of course, even Miss Wolf had not imagined how distressing these sights would be when they involved civilians rather than battlefield soldiers, when they involved shoveling up unidentifiable lumps of flesh or picking out the heartbreakingly small limbs of a child from the rubble. We cannot turn away, Miss Wolf told her, we must get on with our job, and we must bear witness. What did that mean, Ursula wondered. It means, Miss Wolf said, that we must remember these people when we are safely in the future. And if we are killed, then others must remember us. The first serious incident they attended had been at a large house in the middle of a terrace that had received a direct hit. The rest of the terrace was undamaged, as though the Luftwaffe had personally targeted the occupants, 2 families including grandparents, several children, 2 babes in arms. They had all survived the blast, sheltering in the cellar, but both the mains water pipe and a large sewage pipe had fractured, and before either could be turned off everyone in the cellar had drowned in the awful sludge. One of the women had managed to claw her way up and cling onto one of the cellar walls. They could see her through a gap, and Miss Wolf and Mr. Armitage had held onto Hugh's leather belt while Ursula had dangled over the lip of what remained of the cellar. She reached out a hand to the woman, thought for a moment that she might actually manage to grasp hold of her, but then she simply disappeared beneath the feculent water as it rose to fill the cellar. When the fire brigade finally arrived to pump out the place, they recovered 15 bodies, 7 of them children, and laid them in front of the house, as if to dry. Miss Wolf ordered them shrouded as quickly as possible and stowed away behind a wall while they awaited the arrival of the mortuary wagon. "It doesn't do morale any good to see sights like that," she said. Ursula had vomited up her supper long before then. She vomited after nearly every incident. Mr. Armitage and Mr. Palmer too, Mr. Sims before. Only Miss Wolf and Mr. Bullock seemed to have strong stomachs for death. Afterwards, Ursula tried not to think about the babies or the look of terror on that poor woman's face as she had grasped in vain for Ursula's hand, and something else, disbelief perhaps that this could be happening. "Think of them being at peace now," Miss Wolf counseled stoutly afterwards, dispensing scalding hot sugary tea. "They are out of all this, just gone a little sooner." And Mr. Durkin said, "They have all gone into the world of light," and Ursula thought, "They are all gone into the world of light." Ursula wasn't convinced that the dead went anywhere except into a void black and infinite. "Well, I hope I don't die covered in shit," Mr. Bullock said, more prosaically. She thought she would never get over that first terrible incident, but the memory of it had already been overlaid by many others, and now she barely thought about it. "It's bad," Miss Wolf said matter-of-factly. "They need someone slight." "Slight," Ursula repeated. "Slim," Miss Wolf said patiently. "To go in there," Ursula said, looking up in horror at the summit of the volcano. She wasn't sure she had the gumption to be lowered into the very maw of hell. "No, no, not there," Miss Wolf said. "Come with me." It had begun to rain, quite hard, and Ursula blundered with difficulty in Miss Wolf's wake over the jagged and broken ground, littered with every kind of obstacle. Her torch was next to useless. She caught her foot in a bicycle wheel, and wondered if anyone had been riding it when the bomb struck. "Here," Miss Wolf said. It was another mound, just as big as the last. Was it another street, or the same street? Ursula had lost all sense of direction. How many mounds were there? A nightmarish scenario flashed through her mind, the whole of London reduced to one gigantic mound. This mound wasn't a volcano, the rescue squad were going in through a horizontal shaft at the side. More robust this time, they were hacking at the rubble with picks and shovels. "There's a kind of hole here," Miss Wolf said, taking Ursula's hand firmly in hers, as if Ursula were a reluctant child, and leading her forward. Ursula could see no sign of a hole. "It's safe, I think, you just need to wriggle through." "A tunnel." "No, it's just a hole. There's a bit of a drop on the other side, we think there's someone down there." "Not a long drop," she added encouragingly. "Not a tunnel," she said again. "Go head first." The rescue squad stopped hacking at the rubble and waited, rather impatiently, for Ursula. She had to take her helmet off in order to wriggle into the hole, her torch held awkwardly in front of her. Despite what Miss Wolf said, she had been expecting a tunnel but was immediately confronted with a cavernous space. She might have been potholing. She was relieved when she felt 2 pairs of invisible hands attach themselves to Hugh's old leather belt. She moved the torch around trying to see something, anything. "Hello," she shouted as she shone the torch into the drop. It was screened by a haphazard lattice of twisted gas pipes and wood, splintered like matchsticks. She concentrated on a gap in the chaotic mesh, trying to make out anything in the gloom beyond. An upturned face, a man's, pale and ghostly, seemed to rise out of the darkness like a vision, a prisoner in an oubliette. There might be a body attached to the face, she couldn't be sure. "Hello," she said, as if the man might reply, although now she could see that part of his head was missing. "Anyone?" Miss Wolf said hopefully when she crawled backwards out of the hole. "One dead. Easy to recover." "No." The rain made everything even more foul if that were possible, turning the wet brick dust into a kind of glutinous grit. A couple of hours of toiling in these conditions, and they were all covered from head to toe in the stuff. It was too disgusting to give any thought to. There was a shortage of ambulances, traffic had been snarled up by an incident on the Cromwell Road, as had the doctor and nurse who should have been there, and Miss Wolfe's extra first aid training was put to good use. Ursula splinted a broken arm, bandaged a head wound, patched an eye and strapped up Mr. Sims's ankle. He had twisted it on the rough ground. She labeled 2 unconscious survivors, head injuries, broken femur, broken collarbone, broken ribs, what was probably a crushed pelvis, and several dead, who were easier, they were simply dead, and then double-checked them in case she had labeled them the wrong way round and had posted the dead to the hospital and the living to the mortuary. She also directed numerous survivors to the rest center, and walking wounded to the first aid post being manned by Miss Wolfe. "Catch Anthony if you can, will you?" she said when she saw Ursula. "Get a mobile canteen down here." Ursula sent Tony off with this errand. Only Miss Wolfe called him Anthony. He was 13, a Boy Scout and their civil defense messenger boy, hurtling around on the rubble and glass-strewn streets on his bike. If Tony were her child, Ursula thought, she would have sent him far away from the nightmare instead of plunging him into the depths of it. He loved it all, needless to say. After she'd spoken to Tony, Ursula went back through the hole again because someone thought they had heard a sound, but the pale, dead man was as quiet as before. "Hello, again," she said to him. She thought it might be Mr. McCall from the neighboring street. Perhaps he was visiting someone. Unlucky. She was dog-tired, you could almost envy the dead their eternal rest. When she emerged again from the hole, the mobile canteen had arrived. She swillied her mouth out with tea and spat out brick dust. "I bet you used to be a real lady," Mr. Palmer laughed. "I'm affronted," Ursula said and laughed. "I think I spit in a very ladylike way." The rescue on the mound was still going on with no sign of any result, but the rest of the night was winding down, and Miss Wolfe told her to go back to the post and rest. Up on the mound a rope had been called for, to lower someone down, Ursula supposed, or pull someone up, or both. "A woman, they think," Mr. Durkin said. She was all in, could barely put one foot in front of the other. Avoiding the debris as best she could, she had gone only 10 yards or so when someone grabbed her by the arm and yanked her backwards so hard that she would have fallen over if the same person hadn't kept his tight grip on her and kept her upright. "Watch it, Miss Todd," a voice growled. "Mr. Bullock." In the confines of the post Mr. Bullock alarmed her a little, he seemed so unassailable, but curiously, out here in this benighted place he was harmless. "What is it?" she said. "I'm very tired." He shone his torch in front of them. "Can you see?" he said. "I can't see anything." "That's because there's nothing there." She looked harder. A crater enormous, a bottomless pit. 20, maybe 30 feet, Mr. Bullock said. "And you nearly walked into it." He accompanied her back to the post. "You're too tired," he said. He held her arm all the way, she could feel the strength of his muscles behind the grip. At the post she dropped onto a camp bed and blacked out rather than fell asleep. She woke up when the all-clear sounded at 6 o'clock. She felt as if she'd slept for days, but it had only been 3 hours. Mr. Palmer was also there pottering about making tea. She could imagine him at home, slippers and a pipe, reading his newspaper. It seemed absurd that he should be here. "There you go," he said, handing her a mug. "You should go home, dear," he said. The rain stopped, as though it were the rain that had spoiled her night rather than the Luftwaffe. Instead of going straight home, she returned to the mound to see how the rescue was proceeding. It seemed different in the daylight, the shape of it oddly familiar. It reminded her of something, but for the life of her she couldn't think what. It was a scene of devastation, more or less the whole street gone, but the mound, the original mound, was still its own little hive of activity. It would have made a good subject for a war artist, she thought. The Diggers on the Mound would be a good title. Bea Shawcross had been at art school, graduating just as the war started. Ursula wondered if she was moved to depict the war, or if she was trying to transcend it. Very gingerly, she scaled its foothills. One of the rescue squad put out a hand to help her up. A new shift had come on, but from the look of them, the old rescue squad was the one still laboring. Ursula understood. It was hard to leave an incident when somehow you felt you owned it. There was a sudden buzz of excitement around the volcano's crater, as the fruits of the night's delicate drudgery finally became apparent. A woman, a rope tied under her armpits, nothing delicate about this stage, was extricated by simply hauling her out of the narrow opening. She was passed by hand down the mound. Ursula could see that she was almost black with dirt and drifting in and out of consciousness. Broken but alive, if only just. She was loaded into an ambulance waiting patiently at the bottom. Ursula made her own way down. On the ground, a shrouded body lay waiting for a mortuary van. Ursula removed the cover from the face and found the pale-faced man from last night. In the light of day she could see that it was definitely Mr. McCall from number 10. "Hello, you," she said. He would soon be an old friend. Miss Wolfe would have told her to label him, but when she looked for her message pad she discovered she had lost it, and had nothing to write on. Searching in a pocket she found her lipstick. "Needs must," she heard Sylvie's voice say. She thought about writing on Mr. McCall's forehead, but that seemed undignified, more undignified than death, she wondered, so instead she unshrouded his arm, and then spat on a handkerchief and rubbed off some of the dirt, as if he were a little boy. She wrote his name and address on his arm with the lipstick. Blood red, which seemed fitting really. "Well, goodbye," she said. "I don't suppose we'll meet again." Skirting the treacherous crater from last night, she discovered Miss Wolfe sitting behind a dining table salvaged from the wreckage, as if she were in an office, telling people what they should do next, where to go for food and shelter, how to get clothes and ration cards and so on. Miss Wolfe was still cheerful, yet heaven knows when she had last slept. The woman had iron in her soul, there was no doubt about that. Ursula had grown enormously fond of Miss Wolfe, she respected her almost more than anyone else she knew, apart from Hugh perhaps. The queue was made up of the occupants of a large shelter, many of whom were still emerging, blinking in the daylight like nocturnal animals, and discovering that they no longer had homes to go to. The shelter was in the wrong place, the wrong street, Ursula thought. It took her a few moments to reorientate her brain and realize that all night she had thought herself in a different street. "They got that woman out," she told Miss Wolfe. "Alive?" "More or less." When she finally got back to Phillimore Gardens she found Millie up and dressed. "Went the day well," she said. "There's some tea in the pot," she added, pouring it and handing Ursula a cup. "Oh, you know," Ursula said, taking the cup. The tea was lukewarm. She shrugged. "Pretty awful." "Is that the time?" "I have to go to work." The following day she was surprised to find one of Miss Wolfe's log entries, written in her clear matron's hand. Sometimes a buff folder would prove to be a mysterious ragbag, and Ursula was never clear how some of these things turned up on her desk. 05.00 Interim Incident Report. Situation Report. Casualties 55 to hospital, 30 dead, 3 unaccounted for. 7 houses completely demolished, approximately 120 homeless. 2 NFS crews, 2 AMB, 2 HRPs, 2 LRP, 1 dog still operating. Work continues. Ursula hadn't noticed any dog. It was just one of many incidents across London that night, and she picked up a sheaf of them and said, "Miss Fawcett, can you log these?" She could barely wait for the tea trolley and Elevenses. They ate lunch outside on the terrace. A potato and egg salad, radishes, lettuce, tomatoes, even a cucumber. "All grown by our mother's own fair hand," Pamela said. It really was the nicest meal Ursula had eaten in a long time. "And to follow there's an apple charlotte, I believe," Pamela said. They were alone at the table. Sylvie had gone to answer the doorbell and Hugh hadn't returned from investigating an unexploded bomb that had, reportedly, fallen in a field on the other side of the village. The boys were also dining al fresco, sprawled on the lawn, eating buffalo stew and succotash, or, in the real world, corned beef sandwiches and hard-boiled eggs. They had erected a fusty old wigwam that had been unearthed in the shed, and had been engaged in a lawless game of cowboys and Indians until the arrival of the chuckwagon or Bridget, bearing a tray. Pamela's boys were the cowboys and the evacuees were more than happy to be Apaches. "I think it suits their nature better," Pamela said. She had made them cardboard headbands with chicken feathers attached. The cowboys had to make do with Hugh's handkerchiefs tied around their necks. The two Labradors were racing around in a state of canine frenzy at all this excitement, while Gerald, still only 10 months old, slept obliviously on a blanket alongside Pamela's dog, Heidi, too sedate for such antics. "He's some kind of token squaw, apparently," Pamela said. "At least it keeps them quiet. It's like a miracle. It goes rather well with the Indian summer we're having." "6 boys in one house," Pamela said. "Thank God the school term's started. Boys never flag, you have to keep them busy all the time. I suppose this is a flying visit." "'Fraid so." A precious Saturday to herself that she had sacrificed for the sake of seeing Pammy and the boys. She found Pamela drained whereas Sylvie seemed animated by the war. She had become an unlikely stalwart of the WVS. "I'm surprised. She doesn't like other women much," Pamela said. Sylvie now had a large flock of chickens, and had stepped up egg production to wartime levels. "The poor things are forced to lay day and night," Pamela said. "You'd think Mother was running an armaments factory." Ursula wasn't sure how you could make a chicken do overtime. "She talks them into it," Pamela laughed. "A regular henwife." Ursula didn't mention that she had been called to an incident, a house that had been hit, where the occupants had chickens in a makeshift run in the backyard, and that when they arrived they had found the chickens, nearly all of them alive, with their feathers blown off. "Ready plucked," Mr. Bullock had laughed callously. Ursula had seen people with their clothes blown off and trees in the middle of summer stripped of all their leaves, but she didn't mention these things either. She didn't mention wading in effluent from ruptured pipes, certainly didn't mention drowning in that same effluent. Nor did she mention the gruesome sensation of putting your hand on a man's chest and finding that your hand had somehow slipped inside that chest. Dead, something to be thankful for, she supposed. Did Harold tell Pamela the things he had seen? Ursula didn't ask, even introducing the topic seemed wrong on such a pleasant day. She thought of all those soldiers from the last war who had come home, and never spoken of what they had witnessed in the trenches. Mr. Sims, Mr. Palmer, her own father too, of course. Sylvie's egg production seemed to be at the heart of some kind of rural black market. No one in the village was particularly short of anything. "It's a barter economy around here," Pamela said. "And barter they do, believe me. That's what she'll be doing now, at the front door." "At least you're pretty safe here," Ursula said. Were they? She thought of the UXB Hugh had gone to look at. Or the previous week when a bomb had come down in a field belonging to the Hall farm, and blown the cows in it to pieces. "A lot of people have been quietly eating beef around here," Pamela said. "Us included, I'm happy to say." Sylvie seemed to think this terrible episode had put them on a par with London's suffering. She had returned now and lit up a cigarette rather than finish her food. Ursula ate what she had left on her plate while Pamela took one of Sylvie's cigarettes from the packet and lit up. Bridget came out and started clearing plates, and Ursula jumped up and said, "Oh no, I'll do that." Pamela and Sylvie remained at the table, smoking in silence, observing the defense of the wigwam from a raiding party of evacuees. Ursula felt rather badly done by. Both Sylvie and Pamela spoke as if they had it hard, whereas she was working all day, out on patrol most nights, facing the most awful sights. Only yesterday they had been at an incident where they had worked to free someone while blood dripped on their heads from a body up in the bedroom they couldn't reach because the staircase was knee-deep in broken glass from a huge skylight. "I'm thinking of going back to Ireland," Bridget said as they rinsed plates. "I have never felt at home in this country." "Neither have I," Ursula said. The apple charlotte turned out to be simply stewed apples, as Sylvie refused to use precious stale bread on a pudding when it could be fed more usefully to the chickens. Nothing went to waste at Fox Corner. "Scraps went to the chickens, she's thinking of getting a pig," Hugh said in despair. After Bones had made stock they were sent for salvage, as was every last tin and glass jar that wasn't being filled with jam or chutney or beans or tomatoes. All the books in the house had been parceled up and taken to the post office to be sent off to the services. "We've already read them," Sylvie said, "so what's the point in keeping them?" Hugh returned and Bridget grumbled back outside with a plate for him. "Oh," Sylvie said politely to him, "do you live here? I say, why don't you join us?" "Really, Sylvie," Hugh said, more sharply than was his usual manner. "You can be such a child." "If I am, then it's marriage that's made me so," Sylvie said. "I remember that you once said there was no higher calling for a woman than marriage," Hugh said. "Did I? That must have been in our salad days." Pamela raised her eyebrows at Ursula, and Ursula wondered when had their parents become so openly quarrelsome. Ursula was going to ask him about the bomb, but then, "How's Millie?" Pamela asked brightly to change the subject. "She's well," Ursula said. "She's a very easygoing person to share digs with. Although I hardly ever see her in Phillimore Gardens. She's joined ENSA. She's in some kind of troupe that goes round factories, entertaining workers in their lunch hour." "Poor blighters," Hugh laughed. "With Shakespeare?" Sylvie asked doubtfully. "I think she turns her hand to anything these days. A bit of singing, comedy, you know." Sylvie didn't look as if she did. "I have a young man," Ursula blurted out, catching them all unawares, including herself. It was more to lighten the conversation than anything. She should have known better, really. "He was called Ralph. He lived in Holborn and he was a new friend, a pal, that she had met at her German class. He had been an architect before the war and Ursula supposed he would be an architect afterwards too. If anyone was still alive, of course. Could London be erased, like Knossos or Pompeii? The Cretans and the Romans probably went around saying, 'We can take it,' in the heart of disaster. Ralph was full of ideas for the rebuilding of the slums as modern towers. A city for the people, he said, one that would rise from the ashes of the old like a phoenix, modernist to the core." "What an iconoclast he sounds," Pamela said. "He's not nostalgic in the way we are." "Are we? Nostalgic?" "Yes," Ursula said. "Nostalgia is predicated on something that never existed. We imagine an Arcadia in the past, Ralph sees it in the future. Both equally unreal, of course. Cloud-capped palaces. Something like that. But you like him?" "Yes. Have you, you know?" "Really? What kind of a question is that?" Ursula laughed. Sylvie was at the door again. Hugh was sitting cross-legged on the lawn pretending to be Big Chief Running Bull. "It's a very good question," Pamela said. They hadn't, as it happened. Perhaps if he were more ardent. She thought of Crichton. "And anyway there is so little time for sex," Pamela said. "Well, I was going to say courtship, but yes, sex." Sylvie had returned, and was trying to separate the warring factions on the lawn. The evacuees made very unsportsmanlike enemies. Hugh was tied up now with an old washing line. "Help," he mowed to Ursula, but he was grinning like a schoolboy. It was nice to see him happy. Before the war her wooing by Ralph, or his by her, perhaps, might have taken the form of dances, the cinema, cozy dinners à deux, but now, more often than not, they had found themselves at bomb sites, like sightseers viewing ancient ruins. The view from the top deck of the number 11 bus was particularly good for this, they had discovered. It was perhaps due more to a kink in their respective characters than the war itself. After all, other couples managed to keep up the rituals. They had visited the Juvene Gallery at the British Museum, Hammond's next to the National Gallery, the huge crater at the bank, so big that they had to build a temporary bridge across it. John Lewis, still smoldering when they arrived, the blackened mannequins from the shop windows strewn across the pavement, their clothes ripped off. "Do you think we're like ghouls?" Ralph asked, and Ursula said, "No, we are witnesses." She supposed she would go to bed with him eventually. There was no great argument to be found against it. Bridget came out with tea and cake, and Pamela said, "I think I'd better untie Daddy." "Have a drink," Hugh said, pouring her a tumbler of malt from the cut-glass decanter that he kept in the growlery. "I find myself in here more and more these days," he said. "It's the only place I can get peace. Dogs and evacuees strictly barred. I worry about you, you know," he added. "I worry about me too." "Is it bloody?" "Dreadfully. But I believe it's the right thing. I think we are doing the right thing. A just war. You know the Coles still have most of their family in Europe. Mr. Cole has told me some dreadful things that are happening to the Jews. I don't think anyone here really wants to know. Anyway," he said, raising his glass and trying for a cheerful note, "down the hatch. Here's to the end." It was dark when she left, and Hugh walked her down the lane to the station. "No petrol, I'm afraid," he said. "You should have gone earlier," he added ruefully. He had a stout torch, and there was no one to yell at him to put the light out. "I hardly think I'm going to guide in a Heinkel," he said. Ursula told him how most rescue squads had an almost superstitious horror of lights even when they were in the middle of a raid, surrounded by burning buildings and incendiaries and flares. As if a small torch beam would make any difference. "Knew a chap in the trenches," Hugh said, "lit a match, and Bob's your uncle, a German sniper shot his head clean off. Good chap," he added reflectively, "name of Rogerson, same as the bakers in the village. No relation." "You never talk about it," Ursula said. "I'm talking about it now," Hugh said. "Let it be a lesson to you, keep your head below the parapet, and your light beneath a bushel." "I know you don't mean that." "Not really." "I do. I'd rather you were a coward than dead, little bear. Teddy and Jimmy too." "You don't mean that either." "I do. Here we are, it's so dark you could walk right by the station and never see it. I doubt that your train will be on time, if there is a train at all. Oh, look, here's Fred." "Evening, Fred." "Mr. Todd, Miss Todd. So you know, this is the last train tonight," Fred Smith said. Fred had long since graduated from fireman to driver. "It's not really a train," Ursula said, bemused. There was an engine but no carriages. Fred looked back along the platform to where the carriages should have been, as if he'd forgotten their absence. "Ah yes, well," he said, "last time they were seen they were hanging off Waterloo Bridge. It's a long story," he added, clearly unwilling to elaborate. Ursula was puzzled as to why the engine should be here sans carriages, but Fred looked rather grim. "I won't get home tonight then," Ursula said. "Well," Fred said, "I've got to get this engine back up to town, and I've got a head of steam up, and I've got a fireman, old Willie here, so if you want to hop up on the footplate, Miss Todd, I think we can get you back." "Really?" Ursula said. "It won't be as clean as riding on the cushions, but if you're game." "I certainly am." The engine was impatient to go, so she gave Hugh a quick hug and said, "See you soon," and climbed the steps up to the footplate where she took up her perch on the fireman's seat. "You will take care, little bear, won't you?" Hugh said. "In London." He had to raise his voice above the sound of hissing steam. "Promise me." "I promise," she shouted. "See you later." She twisted round, trying to see him on the dark platform as the train chugged off. She felt a sudden stab of guilt. She had played a rowdy game of hide-and-seek with the boys after supper. Instead she should, as Hugh said, have left when it was still light. Now Hugh would have to walk back in the dark alone along the lane. She thought suddenly of poor little Angela, all those years ago. Hugh quickly disappeared into the dark and smoke. "Well, this is exciting," she said to Fred. It didn't cross her mind that she would never see her father again. Exciting, it was true, but also somewhat terrifying. The engine was a great metal beast roaring through the dark, the raw power of the machine come to life. It shook and rocked as if it were trying to dislodge her from its insides. Ursula had never previously thought about what went on in the cab of an engine. She had imagined, if she had imagined it at all, a relatively serene place, the driver alert to the track ahead, the fireman cheerfully shoveling coal. But instead there was non-stop activity, a continual conferring between fireman and driver over gradients and pressure, the frantic shoveling or the sudden closing down, the continual rackety noise, the almost unbearable heat of the furnace, the filthy soot from the tunnels that didn't seem to be kept out by the metal plates that had been put up to prevent light escaping from the cab. It was so hot. Hotter than hell, Fred said. Despite the wartime speed restrictions, they seemed to be traveling at least twice as fast as when she traveled in a carriage on the cushions. She thought, she must remember that for Teddy, who, despite now being a pilot, still harbored his childhood desire to be a train driver. As they approached London they could see fires in the east, and hear the distant pealing of guns, but as they neared the marshalling yards and engine sheds it became almost eerily quiet. They slowed to a halt and all was suddenly, thankfully, peaceful. Fred helped her down from the cab. "There you go, ma'am," he said. "Home sweet home." "Well, not quite, I'm afraid." He looked suddenly doubtful. "I would walk you home, but we have to put this engine to bed. Will you be all right from here?" They seemed to be in the middle of nowhere, just tracks and points, and the looming shadows of engines. "There's a bomb at Marylebone." "We're at the back of King's Cross," Fred said, reading her mind. "It's not as bad as you think." He switched on the weakest of torches, it illuminated only a foot or so in front of them. "Have to be careful," he said, "we're a prime target here." "I'll be absolutely fine," she said, a little more gung-ho than she felt. "Don't give me a second thought and thank you. Good night, Fred." She set off resolutely and immediately tripped over a rail, and gave a little cry of distress when she banged her knee hard on the sharp stones of the track. "Here, Miss Todd," Fred said, helping her up. "You'll never find your way in the dark. Come on, I'll walk you to the gates." He took her arm and set off, steering her as they went, for all the world as if they were on a Sunday stroll along the embankment. She remembered how she had been rather sweet on Fred when she was younger. It would probably be quite easy to be sweet on him again, she reckoned. They reached a big pair of wooden gates, and he opened a small door set within them. "I think I know where I am," she said. She had no idea where she was, but she didn't want to inconvenience Fred any longer. "Well, thank you again, maybe I'll see you next time I get down to Fox Corner." I doubt it," he said. "I start in the AFS tomorrow. Plenty of old codgers like Willie can keep the trains running." "Good for you," she said, although she was thinking how dangerous the fire service was. It was the blackest blackout ever. She walked with a hand in front of her face, and eventually bumped into a woman who told her where she was. They walked together for half a mile or so. After a few minutes on her own again she heard footsteps behind her and she said, "I'm here," so the owner of the feet didn't walk into her. It was a man, no more than a figure in the dark, who went with her as far as Hyde Park. Before the war you would never have dreamed of hooking arms with a complete stranger, particularly a man, but now the danger from the skies seemed so much greater than anything that could befall you from this odd intimacy. She thought it must be nearly dawn when she got back to Phillimore Gardens, but it was barely midnight. Millie, all dressed up, had just returned from an evening out. "Oh my God," she said when she saw Ursula. What happened to you? Did you get bombed? Ursula looked in the mirror and found that she was smudged all over with soot and coal dust. What a fright, she said. You look like a coal miner, Millie said. More like an engine driver, she said, rapidly recounting the night's adventures. Oh, Millie said, Fred Smith, the butcher's boy. He was a bit of a dish. Still is, I suppose. I've got eggs from Fox Corner, she said, removing the cardboard box that Sylvie had given her from her bag. The eggs had been nestled in straw, but now they were cracked and broken from the jolting of the track, or when she fell in the engine yard. The next day they managed to make an omelette from the salvaged remains. Lovely, Millie said. You should get home more often. October 1940. It's certainly busy tonight, Miss Wolfe said. A glorious understatement. There was a full-scale raid in progress, bombers droning overhead, glinting occasionally when they caught a searchlight. Bombs flashed and roared and the large batteries banged and hoofed and cracked, all the usual racket. Shells whistled or screamed on their way up, a mile a second until they winked and twinkled like stars before extinguishing themselves. Fragments came clattering down. A few days ago Mr. Sims's cousin had been killed by shrapnel from the Axe in Hyde Park. Shame to be killed by your own, Mr. Palmer said. Sort of pointless. A red glow over Holborn indicated an oil bomb. Ralph lived in Holborn, but Ursula supposed on a night like this he would be in St. Paul's. It's almost like a painting, isn't it? Miss Wolfe said. Of the apocalypse maybe, Ursula said. Against the backdrop of black night the fires that had been started burnt in a huge variety of colors, scarlet and gold and orange, indigo and a sickly lemon. Occasionally vivid greens and blues would shoot up where something chemical had caught fire. Orange flames and thick black smoke roiled out of a warehouse. It gives one a quite different perspective, doesn't it? Miss Wolfe mused. It did. It seemed both grand and terrible compared to their own grubby little labors. It makes me proud, Mr. Sims said quietly. Our battling on like this, I mean. All alone. And against all odds, Miss Wolfe sighed. They could see all the way along the Thames. Barge balloons dotted the sky like blind whales bobbing around in the wrong element. They were on the roof of Shelmeck's house. The building was now occupied by the Ministry of Supply, for which Mr. Sims worked, and he had invited Ursula and Miss Wolfe to come and see the view from the top. It's spectacular, isn't it? Savage and yet strangely magnificent, Mr. Sims said, as though they were at the summit of one of the Lakeland Fells rather than a building on the Strand in the middle of a raid. Well, I don't know about magnificent exactly, Miss Wolfe said. Churchill was up here the other night, Mr. Sims said. Such a good vantage point. He was fascinated. Later, when Ursula and Miss Wolfe were alone, Miss Wolfe said, You know, I rather had the impression that Mr. Sims was a lowly clerk in the ministry. He's quite a meek soul, but he must be quite senior to have been up on the roof with Churchill. One of the fire watchers on duty on the roof had said, Evening, Mr. Sims, with the kind of respect people felt obliged to afford to Maurice, although in the case of Mr. Sims it was less grudgingly given. He's unassuming, Miss Wolfe said. I like that in a man. Whereas I prefer assuming, Ursula thought. It really is quite a show, Miss Wolfe said. Isn't it, though? Mr. Sims said enthusiastically. Ursula supposed that they were all aware how odd it was to be admiring this show, when they were so painfully conscious of what it meant on the ground. It's as if the gods are throwing a particularly noisy party, Mr. Sims said. One I would rather not be invited to, Miss Wolfe said. A familiar fearful swishing sound made them all duck for cover, but the bombs exploded some way away, and although they heard the explosions bang 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 they couldn't see what had been hit. Ursula found it very odd to think that up above them there were German bombers being flown by men who, essentially, were just like Teddy. They weren't evil, they were just doing what had been asked of them by their country. It was war itself that was evil, not men. although she would make an exception for Hitler. "Oh yes," Miss Wolf said, "I think the man is quite mad." At that moment, to their surprise, a basket of incendiaries came swooping down and crashed its noisy load right on the ministry's roof. The incendiaries cracked and sparked, and the two fire watchers ran towards them with a stirrup pump. Miss Wolf grabbed a bucket of sand and beat them to it. Fast for an old bird was Mr. Bullock's estimation of Miss Wolf under pressure. "What if this were the world's last night?" a familiar voice said. "Ah, Mr. Durkin, you managed to join us," Mr. Sims said affably. "You didn't have any trouble with the man on the door?" No, he knew I was expected," Mr. Durkin said, as if feeling his own importance. "Is anyone left at the post?" Miss Wolf murmured to no one in particular. Ursula felt suddenly compelled to correct Mr. Durkin. "What if this present were the world's last night?" she said. "The word present makes all the difference, don't you think? It makes it seem as if one's somehow in the thick of it, which we are, rather than simply contemplating a theoretical concept. This is it, the end right now, no more shilly-shallying." "Goodness, so much fuss over one little word," Mr. Durkin said, sounding put out. "However, I obviously stand corrected." Ursula thought that one word could mean a great deal. If any poet was scrupulous with words, then it was surely Donne. Donne, himself once the Dean of St. Paul's, had been moved down to an ignominious berth in the basement of the cathedral. In death he had survived the Great Fire of London, would he survive this one too? Wellington's tomb was too hefty to move, and had simply been bricked up. Ralph had given her a tour, he was on the night watch there. He knew everything there was to know about the cathedral. Not quite the iconoclast that Pamela had presumed. When they emerged into the bright afternoon, he said, "Shall we try and get a cup of tea somewhere?" And Ursula said, "No, let's go back to your place in Holborn and go to bed with each other." So they had, and she had felt rotten because she couldn't help thinking about Crichton while Ralph was politely accommodating his body to hers. Afterwards, he had seemed abashed, as if he no longer knew how to be with her. She said, "I'm just the same person as I was before we did this," and he said, "I'm not sure I am." And she thought, "Oh dear God, he's a virgin," but he laughed and said, No, that wasn't it, he wasn't, it was just that he was so very much in love with her, and now I feel, I don't know, sublimated." "Sublimated?" Millie said. "Sounds like sentimental twaddle to me. He has you on a pedestal, heaven help him when he discovers that you have feet of clay." "Thank you. Is that a mixed metaphor, or is it a rather clever image?" Millie, of course, had always, Miss Todd. "Sorry. Miles away." "We should get back to our sector," Miss Wolf said. "It's strange, but one feels rather safe up here." "I'm sure we're not," Ursula said. She was right, for a few days later Shelmach's house was badly hit by a bomb. She was keeping watch with Miss Wolf in her flat. Sitting at her big corner window they drank tea and ate biscuits, and could have been any two women spending the evening together if it hadn't been for the tolling thunder of the barrage. Ursula learned that Miss Wolf's name was Dorcas, which she had never liked, and that her fiancé, Richard, had died in the Great War. "I still call it that," she said, "and yet this one is the greater. At least this time we have right on our side, I hope." Miss Wolf believed in the war, but her religious faith had begun to crumble since the start of the bombing. "Yet we must hold fast to what is good and true. But it all seems so random. One wonders about the divine plan and so on." "More of a shambles than a plan," Ursula agreed. "And the poor Germans, I doubt many of them are in favor of the war. Of course one mustn't say that in the hearing of people like Mr. Bullock. But if we had lost the Great War and been burdened with great debt just as the world's economy collapsed, then perhaps we too would have been a tinderbox awaiting the strike of a Flint, a Mosley, or some such awful person." "More tea, dear." "I know," Ursula said, "but they are trying to kill us, you know," and as if to demonstrate this fact they heard the swish and we that heralded a bomb heading in their direction and flung themselves with remarkable speed behind the sofa. It seemed unlikely that it would be enough to save them, and yet only 2 nights ago they had pulled a woman out, almost unscathed, from beneath an upturned settee in a house that was otherwise more or less destroyed. The bomb shook the Staffordshire cow creamers on Miss Wolfe's dresser, but they agreed it had landed outside their section. They were both finely tuned to the bombs these days. They were also both terribly down in spirits as Mr. Palmer, the bank manager, had been killed when a delayed action bomb had detonated at an incident they were attending. The DE had blown him some distance, and they found him half buried beneath an iron bedstead. He had lost his spectacles but looked relatively unharmed. "Can you feel a pulse?" Miss Wolfe said, and Ursula puzzled as to why she was asking when Miss Wolfe was much more capable of finding a pulse than she was, but then she realized that Miss Wolfe was very upset. "It's different when you know someone," she said, gently stroking Mr. Palmer's forehead. "I wonder where his spectacles are. He doesn't look right without them, does he?" Ursula couldn't find a pulse. "Shall we move him?" she said. She took his shoulders and Miss Wolfe his ankles, and Mr. Palmer's body came apart like a Christmas cracker. "I can put more hot water in the pot," Miss Wolfe offered. To cheer her up, Ursula told her stories about Jimmy and Teddy when they were boys. She didn't bother with Maurice. Miss Wolfe was very fond of children. Her only regret in life was not having had any. If Richard had lived, perhaps, but one cannot look backwards, only forwards. What has passed forever. What is it Heraclitus says? One cannot step in the same river twice. More or less. I suppose a more accurate way of putting it would be, you can step in the same river, but the water will always be new. "You're such a bright young woman," Miss Wolfe said. "Don't waste your life, will you? If you're spared." Ursula had seen Jimmy a few weeks ago. He'd been on 2 days' leave in London, and had bedded down on their sofa in Kensington. "Your baby brother's grown up all handsome," Milly said. Milly was inclined to think all men were handsome, one way or another. She suggested a night on the town, and Jimmy readily agreed. He'd been shut up long enough, he said, time for some fun. Jimmy had always been good at fun. The night almost didn't get started as there was a UXB on the Strand, and they took refuge in the Charing Cross Hotel. "What?" Milly said to Ursula when they had sat down. What? You've got that funny look on your face, the one you get when you're trying to remember something. Or forget something," Jimmy offered. "I wasn't thinking anything," Ursula said. It had been nothing, just something fluttering and tugging at a memory. A silly thing, it always was, a kipper on a pantry shelf, a room with green linoleum, an old-fashioned hoop bowling silently along. Vaporous moments, impossible to hold on to. Ursula repaired to the ladies, where she found a girl crying noisily and rather messily. She was heavily made up, and her mascara was in runnels down her cheeks. Ursula had noticed her earlier having a drink with an older man, rather slimy, had been Milly's verdict on him. The girl looked much younger close up. Ursula helped her to repair her makeup and mop up her tears, but didn't like to pry into the cause of them. "It's Nicky," the girl offered up voluntarily. "He's a bastard. You're young. Man looks lovely, fancy a foursome. I can get us in the Ritz, into the Rivoli bar, I know a man on the door." "Well," Ursula said doubtfully. "The young man's my brother actually, and I don't suppose." The girl gave her a rather sharp jab in the ribs and laughed. "Only joking. You two girls make the most of him, eh?" She offered Ursula a cigarette, which she declined. The girl had a gold cigarette case that looked valuable. "A gift," she said, catching Ursula looking at it. She snapped it shut and held it out for inspection. There was a fine engraving of a battleship on the front with the single word Jutland beneath. If she were to open it up again, she knew she would find the initials A and C intertwined on the inside of the lid, for Alexander and Crichton. Instinctively, Ursula reached out a hand for it and the girl snatched it back, saying, "Anyway, must be getting back. I'm as right as rain now. You seem a good sort," she added, as if there had been a question over Ursula's character. She stuck out her hand. "My name's Renee, by the way, in case we ever bump into each other again. Although I doubt we inhabit the same endroits, as they say." Her French pronunciation was spot on. How odd, Ursula thought. She took the proffered hand, hard and warm as if the girl were running a temperature, and said, "Pleased to meet you, I'm Ursula." The girl, Renee, gave herself one last look of approval in the mirror and said, "Au revoir then," and was off. When Ursula went back into the coffee lounge, Renee ignored her completely. "What a strange girl," she said to Millie. "Been making eyes at me all evening," Jimmy said. "Well, she's barking up the wrong street there, darling, isn't she?" Millie said, batting her eyelashes at him, ridiculously theatrical. "Tree," Ursula said. "Barking up the wrong tree." They went drinking, a merry trio, in all kinds of strange haunts that Jimmy seemed to know about. Even Millie, a seasoned regular of the nightclub scene, professed surprise at some of the places they found themselves in. "Gosh," Millie said as they left a club in Orange Street to totter homeward, "that was different." "A strange android," Ursula laughed. She was rather drunk. It was such an easy word that it was bizarre to hear it from the lips of the Renee girl. "Promise you won't die," Ursula said to Jimmy as they groped blindly home. "Do my best," Jimmy said.